Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much to Tallinn for bringing this Londoner some much-needed sunshine today. It's been fantastic. I'm Dominic from Index Ventures. I'm VP Talent and Insight. Over the last 6 years, we've created a library of deeply researched content addressing topics of key importance to entrepreneurs and their teams. So you just saw a video about those. So the type of topics that we've covered include compensation, international expansion, both to into the US and coming into Europe. And then the latest, which you just saw the video about, which is scaling through chaos, which is all about organization design and scaling teams. So today I wanted to speak to you particularly about hiring and leadership topics. And I should state that all of our content is open sourced. It's openly available on our website in digital form. And to date, we've had over 1 million people accessing and using it. We get about 500-600 users a day. So this launched in March. But just before I get started, give me a sense of the audience. So I'm assuming it's going to be a high percentage, but hands up if you work in a startup or involved in a startup. Cool, about 80%. Hands up if that startup has more than 10 people. Okay, great, about 50%. And finally, if you're a founder or if you envisage at some point in your life you might become a founder. All right, that's a good 60%. Cool, thank you very much. That really helps me. Also, just for everyone in the audience, just get into that founder frame of mind today. It's the sort of mental state, because that's sort of what the content is focused on. And actually, I'm not sure. Here's a clicker. Thank you. Cool. So at Index, we've been very fortunate to partner with many exceptional entrepreneurs and their teams across Europe and the US. We operate as one team. We invest out of 3 funds. Seed, venture, and growth stage. Here in the Baltics, our current portfolio includes Printify and Montonio. And if you go back into our past, we were early investors in Skype and also in TransferWise, Wise now. So we've got a deep affiliation with the Baltics. Our roots are actually in Geneva in the late 90s. So we've now, I'd say we're the only European VC that's really broken into the top tier of Silicon Valley. In terms of my own roots, I was an operator for most of my career. I was a COO in both London and New York. But I joined Index 12 years ago, and I've now worked with over 200 of our companies on any topics around people, talent, leadership, and international expansion. The other half of my role, the insight part, has been I've led all of our content creation, driving that research. So scaling through chaos, and there's a web app that goes with it called Team Plan, which I'll tell you a bit about later. It took us 18 months to create this research. It's the most it's the deepest insight and analysis ever done into how successful startups actually grow their teams and their leaderships. So we kicked off with, we keep a database of all the questions that we've been asked by founders and their teams, and we sifted through that, and we pulled out about 100 topics relating to people, leadership, hiring, etc., that were just FAQs, just constantly coming up. It represented, by the way, well over half the questions we get from our founders are things which link to people. So we wanted to do a quantitative analysis into this as well. So we pulled together a data set. So first we selected 210 of the best performing startups of the last 15 years. And we pulled together employee profiles for the first 1,000 people that they hired. In fact, it was more than that. It was all the people that they hired to take them from 0 employees to 1,000. So we pulled all those profiles together, obviously anonymized. We then labeled them. We tagged them so we could get a sense of what the job functions were, the seniority, the backgrounds of those individuals. And then we ran hundreds of analyses. And we pulled out a whole load of insights. We tested hypotheses, and we turned those into charts, and we enriched that with a whole load of interviews we did, as you saw in the video. And that led to this book. And then we created a summary data set from all the data that we'd pulled, and that's what Team Plan is. So in Team Plan, you can explore yourself. You can select companies in our data set and see actually what was their hiring sequence, who did they hire when, what did their leadership team look like at this point in time. And I should say all of our content is fully accessible, right? It's fully open sourced. And we launched in March. So one of the key messages in Scaling Through Chaos is that when you're in high growth, you can expect as a founder that half your time is going to be taken up on stuff to do with people. When you're in high growth, you might be doubling your headcount year on year over several years. And that puts a huge amount of stress on the organization, and it leads to, inevitably, a fair amount of chaos. Right? If you imagine, half your workforce at any point in time is going to be new. So what you're actually doing as a founder with that people time, though, varies considerably. In the very early days, it's very weighted, as you can see here, to hiring. Actually, I should say a note, just about the charts. I'm going to show you a lot of charts where the breakdown is by headcount stage. So you can see on the axis here, 1 to 10, 11 to 50, 51 to 125, up to 501 to 1,000. So those are different stages, and really that's because headcount is a key driver of organizational complexity. More than anything, more than revenue, more than funding, or whatever. So that was the way, and the whole book breaks down a whole load of topics by stage of organization, by headcount band. So you can see those early stages, you're very focused on hiring, which is the light green. As a company scales, that goes down, but instead you're spending a lot of that time on leadership team alignment and on internal comms. And that really mirrors a sort of shift, as I see it, in the founder's role. I talk about three phases. Right? All of these are important at all stages, but what's the emphasis? In the very early stages, you're the chief building officer. Your focus is on building the product, iterating it, just trying to execute on what's in your head, on the vision. As you go into the middle stages, or sort of growth stages of a startup, your then emphasis turns to what I say the chief decision officer. You've got a whole load of teams, loads of people working on loads of different things, but all those decisions are coming back to you. You're having to say yes to that, no to that, prioritize this, double down on that, stop this. So that's the real focus. You don't have the leadership team yet to be delegating those decisions to. Then in later stages, your attention shifts. You become what I call the chief inspiration officer. So your focus is really around inspiring, aligning, motivating your team and your leadership and sort of driving that. So I'd sort of say, for you as founders or potential founders, you have to really think about what the implications of this chart are for what you're actually doing and for you emotionally and practically. Are you ready for that shift in your role if you're going to grow a really big business? And we really look for that, obviously, in founders. We're looking for founders who can sort of show the aptitude or the capability to make that step change. Okay, so I'm going to now talk about hiring. As I put it here, now, how do you create a team of stars rather than A-holes and B players? So, foundations. You really have to focus on these foundations. So, values and vision. So it's important to establish what your vision is early on. I'd say that's what's the change that you want to make your company to make in the world, and what are your values? So what's the type of culture that you want to inculcate and nurture in your organization? And what you want to do is a really important hiring filter. You want to hire people into your organization who are aligned with your mission, highly aligned on your values, but they bring diversity in terms of the competencies, experience, and backgrounds that they have. So you really want to bring those things together. Now, those will evolve, right? You want to articulate. It's really important that those things are also aligned between you as a founding team, because if you as founders can't get focused and coordinated on those things, you're going to have problems later. And they will evolve. You'll revisit both your vision, your mission, your values periodically as you grow. But as you grow as well, you'll start to need to introduce process, right? And process is a bit of a word in the startup world. But as you scale, it's just inevitable. One of the set of processes, we're talking about people here, are around people processes. So I list 6 here. things like performance management and learning and development, etc. The important thing is that you don't introduce process too fast. You're doing it gradually, incrementally, and what's appropriate for your stage. And in the book, we go through each of these processes, and we say, at this stage, this is probably the light touch way of doing it. And as you go through, enrich it, add this. That might be things like leveling or whatever it is. Another set of processes that you have to look at as you scale is around planning. So again, planning in the early days is the kiss of death. It will stifle your creativity. But once you've got multiple teams working on different projects, getting that alignment coordination is critical. And also when you've got a lot more capital, you have to really think about your cash flow and you have to be capital efficient. So things like OKRs, budgeting processes, management and executive committees, the like. And the final thing I want to say here is around how do you keep that hiring bar up? How do you keep hiring quality? So in the early days, you're doing all the hiring as a founder. You're going to delegate that as you grow. And you need to have a methodical way of building the bench of people who you trust and who you feel are qualified in the organization to be making those hiring decisions, running interviews, and doing that filter. So the overall message here is, I put it as it's like surfing, right? And it's surfing. You've got a wave. A wave of chaos is chasing you as you're building the business. And if you go too far ahead of the curve, if you go too far ahead of the wave, you're going to come to a standstill. You'll get dead, and that's bureaucracy. You move too fast. You put too much process in too early. But if you don't go fast enough, then the chaos is going to overwhelm you. Wave is going to crash over you. Again, that's why everything is stage appropriate in the book. So, I should have asked a question about this first, but this is looking at what happens to your earliest hires. Remember, these are like top performing companies that we analyzed. So this is looking at the first 10 hires you make into a startup, and then as the company grows, how many of those people are still with the company at those different stages. So you can see even by 50 employees, it was down to 5 or 6. By 125, 4. By the time you're at like IPO type of stage, 1,000 people, you've got 2 or 3 of those people will be left. And that really reflects, more than anything, the realities of what type of skill sets you need in a startup. The best employees at very early stages are those real generalists, people who can change, flip what they're doing, they're super adaptable, they don't mind jumping into something they're not very familiar with, not just every day, but every hour, right? And I've worked in a few of those environments. I know what it's like. I'm more drawn to this stage, those early stages personally. But as you grow, you need to bring in more specialist skill sets. You need people who are more focused. They've got a more clear role delineation, but they're really excellent at that role, and they can drive it well. And that's just a brutal reality. But at the same time, whilst it's difficult parting ways with some of these individuals and people that you've worked with and done those crazy long hours with and weekends and whatever, it's just necessary if you're going to build a successful business. At the same time, it's really important to recognize and celebrate the importance of those people and what they've done for you, and be very generous and warm to them as they leave the company. That's a sort of quote from Kate Ryder, which sort of shows an example of how you can do that. Another thing we looked at in the book is what the impact is of the experience of your founding team. So we split up our sample into companies built by either younger, less experienced founding teams or older, more experienced teams. Of course, you can have amazing entrepreneurs, can come from both camps. We have zero bias towards either of those groups. We've had amazing success working with either. But this is looking in this chart what the composition of the technical team looks like in terms of the experience profile of those people when the company overall is 50 strong. So you might have maybe 20, 25 people in the technical team at this point. And what this is showing, if you turn that chart into actually what it means in terms of people, it means that in a company founded, remember these are top performing companies. These are companies like Figma, right? You know, Dylan was a university dropout virtually when he started the company. It means that in those companies, you'll have 2 fewer people in your technical team with an advanced career profile, and instead you'll have 2 additional people who have an early career profile. Now, in a team of 20, that's a big difference in terms of the overall capabilities of the team. And you do need experienced people in the team to provide that mentorship, coaching, development to the more junior members in your team. Also, as you start to form squads in your technical team, you'll need TLMs, right? Tech lead managers to drive them. And that's difficult if you don't have the experience. So what we do when we work with founders, if we're working with less experienced founders, we try and help them by making introductions to more experienced talent that they probably wouldn't have access to in their own networks. And then with more experienced founding teams, we try and bring diverse candidates to them. Try and build, because the potential challenge if you're an experienced founder is you overhire from your network and you create a monoculture. And you've got to sort of diversify as well if you're going to keep growing. Right, so just let's look at what hiring funnels look like. Right, I mentioned earlier, in the very early days as a founder, you'll be doing all the hiring yourself. You'll be making every hiring decision. You'll be probably hiring from network, etc. But when you start to scale, you need to build a recruiting engine. And what does a recruiting engine actually look like in the top companies? And it is quite frightening, actually. I won't go through every single piece of data in this chart. I can see people taking photos, which is fine. This is a hiring funnel for technical hires. So imagine that in the next quarter, you want to make 4 technical hires. Now, you'll have different stages in the interview process for that. Obviously, you have to do all sorts of sourcing and outreach and filtering through inbound job applications and the like. You'll then do screening interviews by video. You'll then candidates do coding tests, bring them to on-site interviews, then do founder interviews and make offers. So when you look at overall funnel, you see, and this is based on real metrics from top companies, you get about a 6% conversion rate through that funnel. In other words, for every hire you want to make, you need to be speaking to 15 candidates. Right? That's a crazy, and if you add up all the conversations involved through that cycle, for each hire you make, 40, 45 different touch points, interviews, conversations, etc. So there's a lot of implications to this chart. First is that most startups don't do this, right? They don't make such a rigorous hiring process in place. And the danger of doing that is you end up hiring weaker people. Right? You will end up with the B players that I mentioned, not the A players. If you actually look, like I remember pulling this funnel together with Datadog in their Paris office, right, for their engineering team. It was a 30-to-1 ratio for them, right? So I'm not being silly here. Like, it's real data. So this is what is involved. Second implication is the importance of referrals. Right? You can see here, like referred candidates, people coming either from your network or from the networks of your employees or maybe your angels and investors, have a much higher conversion rate. So if you can you don't want to overdo it on hiring for network, but if you can take that proportion up to a third, so that's usually the optimal, a third, a half, you can massively reduce the amount of effort involved in hiring. The third implication is the importance of building internal recruiting capability. So the rule of thumb I usually use with our companies is if you're looking to hire 15 or more people in the next 12 months, then your most important hire becomes an experienced internal recruiter. Right? Just think of the amount of sourcing involved in running this process, the amount of screening you have to do, all the scheduling of interviews. It's a huge amount of work, and it's great if you've got somebody who can really take that on and own it. Otherwise, again, the danger is that the quality bar will drop. By the way, of course, technical hires tend to have the most steps in the process, be the most challenging, which is why I focused on it, but it applies less so, but same across other roles. All right, turning from retention to attrition, we were also able in our data set to look at attrition rates by function and by role. So you can see here from the top, like annualized attrition rates. Now this data comes from larger companies because that's where we had a lot of data which we could crunch. But when we matched it, it was very similar to the patterns that you see in earlier stage companies as well. So the highest attrition rates, probably not surprisingly, are SDRs and marketing and HR, which did surprise me a bit. The lowest attrition rates were in engineering, design, and legal. Now, when you're an early stage company, you don't have, I love attrition metrics, but you can't use them when you're an early stage company. You just don't have the data. But actually what you need to be doing is, and my recommendation to founders is, obsess over every leaver that you have. Everybody who leaves the team, do a post-mortem, right? Why did the person leave the company? Do you regret them leaving the company? If you don't regret them leaving the company, should you have hired them in the first place? Was it an error in your hiring process? Maybe it wasn't, but maybe it was. What can you fix to avoid that happening next time? And if they did leave, if you did regret them leaving, sorry, got caught up there. If you did regret them leaving, what was it that went wrong, right? Was it that your compensation policies were wrong? Was it that there's a manager that is not a very good manager? Or were you not offering the type of career progression that that individual was looking for? So you really want to dig into that, unpack it, make learnings, course correct, keep improving. Right, moving on to leadership. So executives, I define an executive as somebody who has a VP title or a C-suite title. Okay? And what we did here is looked at how many executives do you find in companies according to that headcount stage. And you'll see here, the most intense executive team building phase of a company is between 125 and 500 headcount. Obviously, there's quite a lot of variability here, but this was the sort of medians, and it did weigh quite heavily in that. So you go from 5 executives at 125 on average to 10 at 10. To 10 by 500 people. Actually, it's more extreme than that, because when you look at that average 5 executives at 125 headcounts, I sort of did an analysis and reviewed the profiles of those individuals. Of course, you can't know for sure, but about a third of them, in my mind, didn't look like true executives. When you looked at the depth of their experience, it looked like they benefited from job title inflation. They'd been given an inflated job title, right? Which is very common. I really, really caution against it, but it still happens. I mean, these are top-performing companies, and it was still happening in them. But really caution against that for a whole sort of reasons. But I won't dig into that one now. But in fact, you might have more like 3 or 4 real executives by 125. So not only are you having to hire these new roles, you're having to up-level for people who actually can't cope with the demands of the role as you scale. So it's a big, intensive task. And it's even more intensive for founders. I would say, sorry for all of you who are early stage founders, and I know it's incredibly painful, but the actual, in some ways, the most stressful, exhausting phase of a startup is this, I think, for founders, because not only are they having to try and hire these executives and build that team, they're in the meantime having to fulfill and run those teams themselves, because they probably don't have the bench of people to take over those roles. So they're having to directly run those functions, be it a sales function or a marketing function. They're having to step in and do it whilst hiring people. And piece of advice here is do not try to hire more than 2 executives at any one time, right? Running executive search processes is exhausting, right? It involves you as a founder a lot. You have to be selling to all these different candidates, as well as assessing, closing, reference checking. It's exhausting. And you've got all these other things. You're trying to run the function at the same time. So do not do it. You need to have time when you bring in an executive to then onboard that executive, bed them in, understand what their strengths and weaknesses are, and then you know what type of profile you take the learnings to take into the next hire. So you have to be methodical about it, but don't rush it. It's an old hiring mantra, right? No hire is better than a bad hire. And that applies 10x when it comes to executive hires. Right. Of course, when you're hiring, you've got another alternative. When you're hiring for senior roles, you can promote internally, or you can look for candidates externally. So built a framework here to provide a sort of guidelines for what proportion of senior roles should you be targeting to fill from internal candidates rather than from external hires. And that varies by size of company again. So, for example, the 126 to 250 headcount phase, what we're suggesting here is that for director-level appointments, 30% of those could be filled potentially by internal candidates. So 70% hired outside, 30% from inside. Again, I emphasize this is in high growth, right? So this is the doubling headcount year-on-year situation. If you're growing slower, you can probably do that, fill from internally more. But the overall trend you can see in this chart, the bigger the company, your company, the more likely it is that you can fulfill roles from promotions. But the more senior the role, the less likely it is. And that makes sense, right? And that's how this model is built, because it takes time to nurture, develop, stretch, challenge your existing people so that you know that they're capable of making the step up, but you're hiring really fast. So this model reflects that balance between your hiring needs versus your ability to develop and build conviction about internal candidates. So really that's the overall message here is like and what we're looking for. So it's a key point. It also applies to those early hires. It's a recurring message and theme, I'd say, is we look to see, does a founder overvalue loyalty over excellence, right? And a key thing here is, according to the role, like, what are the competencies that you really need for that role? Are those competencies existing in your team currently, or do you need to bring them in from the outside? So for instance, if you're looking to fulfill a sales director role, but your company at that stage is starting to move from targeting mid-market to enterprise clients, do you have the people internally who have experience of enterprise selling? If not, you're going to have to go outside, right? So you really think about those competencies. It's more likely to happen in roles like engineering. You're more likely to have those, especially at senior levels. Those are big, mature teams. You're more likely to have the experience internally. If you're talking about something like a CFO or a general counsel, it's incredibly unlikely you'll have that skill set internally. But you also see, because we were talking about executive hiring earlier, it's always a very small proportion of executives that you're likely to find internally. I always think it's amazing and really important to try and find one or two people in your team who can step up to executive roles. But the majority, it's brilliant culturally. It really shows that there's no glass ceiling. There's no ceiling to where your career can go in your company. But you are most of the time going to have to look externally when you're in high growth. Right, product. Product leadership is a particularly emotional one for founders, right? We said earlier, in the early phases, your role is the chief building officer. You are the chief product officer in the early days. But as you scale your company, you have to start delegating product ownership and product leadership. Why do you have to do that? Well, one, as you start to scale your business, as we saw, your time is going to have to go on to other things. You have to be involved in hiring, in selling, in fundraising. You just won't have enough time to really keep focused on product in that way. Second reason is your product team itself will be growing. And those people need to be coached, mentored, nurtured, developed. And again, you won't have the time to do that day to day. And thirdly, when in the early days, product roadmap is defined by the vision in your head. You're executing and building according to that vision. But as you scale, your roadmap is increasingly driven by feedback from customers, from prospects, from market research, from customer support. And pulling all of that feedback together and prioritizing it isn't something that really is a sensible thing for a founder to be doing. So you can see here in the data, this data is basically saying who is the most senior person in a product role in the organization as it grew. And you can see there's different phases. And those are summarized below. So we usually say there's 4 phases in terms of the founder's relationship to product. First is when you make your first PM hire, your first product manager. And that's really an individual who's the person who's interfacing with your engineers, working every hour of every day, actually executing. But you still, as a founder, own the roadmap, and you still own the product strategy. Second phase, so it's the sort of 125 headcount type of area, is where you have a sort of head or director of product. And this is somebody, your product team by this stage might be 3, 6 people. So it's a person who can lead that small team And they can take some ownership of the roadmap, but you're jointly agreeing the roadmap with them. So the founder is not stepping back too quickly. They're still driving that, and the founder still very much drives the product strategy. In the third phase, which is usually like from 250 headcount or so, is when you start looking at an executive level product leader. It's like a VP product, typically. And this person will take primary ownership of the roadmap, because you've probably scaled by the point now where the roadmap is driven, as I said, by feedback from other places rather than your own vision. So that's owning the roadmap with you, but you jointly agree the product strategy. So this is somebody who can really feed into like strategic decisions, but with you. The fourth phase usually doesn't come, actually, in my experience, until after you've IPO'd a company. It's like much, much later. So I call like the CPTO. So this is a Chief Product Technology Officer, somebody who can take overall executive ownership of the entire technical team and drive that forward. And they'll be owning sort of product strategy as well. So it's much, much later. Rarely see it. Now, one of the things, there's two dangers here. First danger is that founders don't let go of product fast enough, and they get overwhelmed, right? They just can't, it's too much bandwidth, it's too much of a stretch. I say the only exception here is if you've got a founder whose superpower and really strong experiences in product. So like one of our highly performing companies is Remote, right? Remote.com. And the founder there, is a previous VP product, right? So he's like, I don't want to hire as like a VP product because that's what I've done. I know I can do this role, and it's what I can do better than anybody else for this product. So he stays very, very involved in it, but that's the exception. And he's used to running product teams of 20, 30, 40 people. The opposite danger, which you do sometimes see founders do, is that they come across a senior product leader early, and they're like, oh my gosh, I want to bring them in. And that, I've never seen it work out, to be honest. I've never seen it work out. Because at that stage, the founder has to own the product. And if you bring in somebody really senior, they want to own the strategy. And you get into this tug of war, and it never ends well. You know, eventually, the founder just gets frustrated. Both parties get frustrated. So, we've got 11 minutes left. Actually, I will say something, right? This is a sort of emotional topic, but I will say something about it. It's around the role of co-founding CTOs. Do we have any co-founding CTOs in the audience today? Okay, all right. Well, this is a sensitive topic, but this is looking at what happens to co-founders. So CEOs in green versus CTOs in blue as companies scale. How many of them stay with the business? So you can see for the sort of CEOs, even by sort of IPO type of stage, 1,000 people, 85% of the companies that we analyzed still had a founding CEO in role. The CTOs, co-founding CTOs, it starts to drop down a lot, particularly after about 250 headcount. So it drops 75%, and then for about 3/4, a quarter of those businesses still have a co-founding CTO there in place. And that really reflects just how massively the CTO role changes. Because in the early days, right, if you as a founder, the chief building officer, I mean, the CTO even more so, that is the real focus. So you have to have that real hacking, high velocity, super hands-on mindset to be an amazing co-founding CTO. But that's a really different skill set from running and managing and developing what is the biggest team in most software businesses, you know, the engineering and technical teams. And not many co-founding CTOs make that transition successfully. They end up usually getting frustrated. They don't get the same joy out of it. Doesn't mean that none do. I mean, I interviewed, and I know anyway, Alexis at Datadog, who's co-founding CTO. We've got a technical team of 2,000 people now, and he's relishing the role more than ever, I think. So it doesn't mean it can't happen, but it's rarer, right? So you have to be ready. Again, it's this, you have to be prepared as founders to have the mature conversations, like what's in the best interests for the company. And I usually find in these type of conversations, if you roll forward, because they are emotional, they can be painful, those transitions and those saying goodbyes, whatever, and they can sometimes be fractious. Almost always, a couple of years later, you speak to those CTOs and they're like, thank God I did that. I'm so much happier. I wasn't really enjoying the role anymore. So usually things which are better for the company usually end up being better for the individuals affected as well, I'd say. So sorry, that's a bit of a, I wasn't sure whether to share this, but we've had the time. But it's like, there's a whole load of different analyses like this. I showed you about 8 or 9 charts and frameworks. There's about 50 or 60 in the book. So I do encourage you to read it and also have a play around with Team Plan. We're having, as I said, on these resources, about 200 people a day have been using them so far. And we're always very happy when people do. But we've got about 8 or 9 minutes for questions, so happy to turn it over.
Got volunteers as well, so going around with microphones to take them for you as well. But before that, just quickly, you've written quite a few books. Do you want to go through the ones that you've written and who are they for and for what type of issues?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. As I said, there's 4 different content areas which we've covered so far. So probably the one which probably gets the most traction is called Rewarding Talent, and there's a web app called Option Plan to go with it. And this is particularly looking at employee equity, right, stock options. And I'm delighted to say Estonia, we have a national rankings. We do an international league table on stock option policy, and Estonia is almost like right up there near the top. It's like terrific from a legislative point of view. But this is really a guide, not just to how to issue stock options in each country. More importantly, it's a whole philosophy of reward and comp to use for your employees. And it's taking as a starting point the fact that US companies, US startups tend to offer a lot more equity to their teams than European companies do. And say, why is that? What are the benefits of using equity as a way of hiring, motivating, retaining, aligning your team? So that's the first one. Second and third were around international expansion. So they're really playbooks. One of them is going to be less relevant to any of the audience here because it's a playbook for US founders about how to succeed in really expanding into Europe. But the other one is around international expansion from Europe into the US. So it has a whole layer of like different archetypes and different models and when to expand, where to expand, who to hire, which we were talking about earlier, who's your first hire or landing teams or whatever, and all of those type of questions, it goes through all of them. So those are the other topics before we did this one.
Yeah, so if the volunteers are ready, anyone who has a question, please put the hand up. Yep, could I get a mic? I think you gentlemen were first before. So can we get a mic to... Or maybe not. Do you want to just speak up? Yeah.
All right.
Interesting. Rehiring.
Yeah, rehiring. So yeah, what do I think about rehiring people left for? It really depends on, obviously, the circumstances. I wouldn't say never ever do it. It all really depends. Why did they leave, or why did you choose to part ways with them earlier in the journey? And I think anything with hiring, as I said, no hire is better than a bad hire. So are you doing it from a position of conviction and intent, or are you doing it out of desperation? Like, if you're doing it out of desperation, do not. Maybe it's that you hired, I have seen this before, you hired somebody anticipating a change in the business which needed new skills that person had, and then it didn't happen, right? I used the example earlier, you want to move into enterprise, selling to enterprises. But that was dependent on your product being enterprise ready. But for various reasons, your product wasn't ready when you hired that person. So they didn't have anything to sell. Fair enough, right? A year later, hey, we are ready now. We're ready to go. We'd love you to join. Yeah, that sort of situation is fine. But I say it's usually quite rare, but yeah.
Then we had, I think, another one over there with the gentleman, I think, with the fedora. If you can get the mic to him.
Love the hat.
Hi, Kirill from ContentQuo. We're a B2B SaaS for LLM quality evaluation. Question, on the way from 10 to 50 hires, which role is the most risky? Which role me as a CEO should pay the most attention to when hiring for?
Good question. I mean, all of these things, right? It depends. I mean, I said it. Couple of things, like and it does so much depend on the on your business model and what stage of play, the existing competencies, whatever. But a couple of roles. I mean, you won't be surprised. Like first sales leader. If you're starting to monetize and you're into traction, that first sales leader, first salesperson, different. First sales pioneer. But that decision, if you've established a basic sales methodology, that first sales leader who can build a team around them is one really critical one. And the other one, probably echoing what I said earlier, is having a really experienced internal recruiter. I think it can be an enormous unlock, both in terms of hiring velocity, but more importantly, of giving you the capacity to retain a really high hiring bar, right? So much, I've seen this, right? I've worked with hundreds of companies over 12 years. That ability to keep your talent density high is so critical. Once it starts to drop, it's really hard to bring it back up again because, it's the old adage, A players hire A players, B players hire B and C players, right? If you start to have a lower quality in your team, the referrals you get from those people are likely to be lower quality and you drag the quality of your team up. If you can keep that high, keeping it high, that's like, and as I said, there's so much filtering and outreach and sourcing involved in doing that having internal recruiter is, I think, really critical. So it'd be two of them.
Quick question on that. How do you qualify a good recruiter in the early stage? Because, what is an experience? What kind of skill set?
Yeah. Good question. I mean, there's a whole section on this in the book, so I don't want to repeat it. Go and read that. We go through a whole load of things around the profiles of first recruiters. It does slightly depend, of course, a lot of these things, right? And I'm really aware, right? The primary audience we're speaking to with this book are in the US, right? Obviously, talent pools and quality of talent pools varies a lot by location. But ideally, you want, it's the same thing with like a sales leader or whatever else. But for an experienced recruiter, I'm saying somebody who's had at least 5 years of experience of recruiting, and what you're looking for as well, people who've recruited into technical roles is a really real benefit if you're a software company. If they don't have that experience, they're not going to be able to effectively do those first screening and filters. That's really important. Somebody who's done more than just the pure recruiting piece. You want somebody who can also contribute into areas like your employer branding, so building your talent brand, and some of the initial, they need to be very flexible and okay to get involved in some of the compliance things, right? Just putting offers together, things like that. So you want them to be a great recruiter, but to be very flexible and willing to go slightly stretch, not just being purely heads down recruiting, like thinking about the broader building the recruiting engine piece.
And then we had one more quick question.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for sharing this information. It was amazing. So question is, we are 4 founders and we need to hire first employees. And so when you hire those first 10 people, do you need to hire people who actually can become team leads? So let's say we have like partner sales and customer sales. Do we need salespeople that afterwards are going to hire those sales teams? Or there is some other approach?
No, I don't think you need to. You hire for what your needs are what you anticipate the needs are for the next, in your early stages, like next 6 to 9 months. There's somebody who can do the role now and has some runway that you think they're in their sweet spot for like the next 9 to 12 months at least. You can't anticipate where the company is going to go exactly after that, what your needs are, what the velocity is going to be. So don't try and solve tomorrow, the day after tomorrow's problem. Solve today and maybe tomorrow, but not the day after, right? So you'll fall over. So solve those things later. Each stage in a startup is, solving today's problem earns you the right to solve tomorrow's problem. And that's the continuous journey as you go. So don't think too far ahead on that.
Cool. We're absolutely out of time. Dominic, thank you for coming. Thank you for accepting invite, and thank you for
Thank you for the invite from Karma Ventures. Thank you.